The Bodie heat was merciless in the summer of 1889, turning the high desert California into a furnace that tested the endurance of every living thing. Samuel Garrett's ranch sat in a valley between the barren hills, where stubborn grass and hardy cattle managed to survive on precious little water and endless determination. At 67, Samuel had learned to read the desert like scripture. Every cloud formation, every shift in the wind, every change in animal behavior told him something about what was coming. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of the woman, who emerged from the heat shimmer on the dusty road that led to his property. She moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose feet were too damaged for normal walking, her torn calico dress hanging loose on a frame that spoke of recent hunger and hardship. Her dark hair, streaked with premature gray, hung in tangled waves around a face that might once have been beautiful, but now bore the haunted expression of someone who had seen too much suffering. Most striking of all, she was barefoot, her feet cracked and bleeding from walking across rocks and thorns, leaving small spots of blood in the dust behind her with every painful step. Samuel had been widowed for 15 years, living alone with his cattle and his memories in a landscape that demanded both solitude and self-reliance. He was not a man given charity or sentiment, having learned through hard experience that the frontier punished weakness and rewarded only strength and cunning. But something about this woman's dignity, the way she held her head high despite her obvious distress, commanded his attention and grudging respect. She stopped at his gate without speaking, her dark eyes meeting his with a directness that suggested intelligence and determination despite her desperate circumstances. Samuel could see that she was perhaps 30 years old, though hardship had aged her beyond her years. Her hands, when she gripped the wooden gate post for support, showed the calluses and scars of someone accustomed to hard physical labor. She was clearly a working woman, probably from one of the mining camps or settlements that dotted the region, though what had brought her to his remote ranch remained a mystery. "Water?" she asked finally, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. The single word carried no pleading or self-pity, just a straightforward request from one human being to another. Samuel nodded and walked slowly to the well, drawing up a bucket of the precious liquid that meant life or death in this harsh country. He filled a tin cup and handed it to her without comment, watching as she drank deeply but carefully, savoring every drop while maintaining the self-control of someone who had learned not to waste anything that might sustain life. "Thank you," she said when she had finished, her voice already stronger with the simple gift of clean water. Samuel studied her face, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the absence of the desperate cunning that characterized most of the drifters and fugitives who occasionally found their way to his property. This was someone who had fallen on hard times through circumstance rather than choice, a victim of whatever forces had driven her to seek refuge in the middle of nowhere. "You can't walk much farther on those feet," Samuel observed, his voice carrying the practical assessment of someone who understood the realities of survival in hostile country. "Where were you headed?" The woman's smile was bitter but not defeated. "Away," she said simply. "Just away from where I was." Samuel understood that answer better than most people would have. The frontier was full of people running from something: creditors, abusive husbands, criminal charges, or simply the failure to find their place in an increasingly civilized world. He had learned not to ask too many questions about people's pasts, focusing instead on who they were in the present moment and how they chose to conduct themselves under pressure. Samuel made a decision that surprised him with its spontaneity. He had lived alone for so many years that the idea of sharing his space with another person should have been unthinkable, but something about this woman's quiet dignity moved him to an uncharacteristic act of generosity. "Come up to the house," he said, opening the gate and gesturing toward a modest adobe structure that had been his home for 30 years. "Get those feet tended to before they get infected." The woman hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to trust this stranger who lived in such isolation. Samuel understood her caution. A woman alone in the frontier had to be careful about accepting help from men, even when desperation made refusal potentially fatal. "I've got a spare room," he added, trying to make his offer sound practical rather than threatening. "Used to belong to my wife before she passed. You can rest up, get your strength back, and decide what you want to do next." It was a mention of his deceased wife that seemed to tip the balance in his favor. The woman's posture relaxed slightly as she realized that this man understood loss and might therefore be trusted to offer help without expecting anything improper in return. She followed him slowly toward the house, her damaged feet making each step a visible effort despite her attempts to hide her pain. Samuel's ranch house was simple but well-maintained, reflecting the practical sensibilities of a man who had learned to take care of himself and his possessions. The interior was clean and functional, though it clearly lacked the touches that only a woman's presence could provide. The spare room he offered was small but comfortable, with a proper bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley where his cattle grazed. "There's soap and clean water for washing," Samuel said, setting down a basin and towel. "I'll see what I can find for your feet. Got some salve that works well on cuts and scrapes." He left her alone to clean up and tend to her injuries, busying himself in the kitchen with the preparation of a simple meal. Samuel was not an accomplished cook, but he knew how to make nourishing food from basic ingredients: beans, salt pork, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to dissolve horseshoes. It was frontier fare, designed for sustenance rather than pleasure, but it would restore strength to someone who clearly hadn't eaten well in days. When the woman emerged from the spare room an hour later, the transformation was remarkable. Clean and wearing a dress that Samuel had found among his wife's store belongings, she looked younger and less desperate, though the haunted expression in her eyes remained unchanged. Her feet were carefully bandaged with strips of cloth, and she moved with less obvious pain than before. "I'm Sarah Mitchell," she said formally, extending her hand in the manner of someone who had been raised with proper manners despite her current circumstances. "I'm grateful for your kindness, mister." "Samuel Garrett," he replied, accepting her handshake with the respect due to any adult who conducted themselves with dignity. "And you're welcome to stay as long as you need to get back on your feet." The double meaning of his words wasn't lost on either of them, and Sarah's smile was the first genuinely warm expression he had seen from her. Over the simple meal they shared at his kitchen table, Samuel learned the basics of Sarah's story without prying into details that she might prefer to keep private. She had been married to a mine supervisor in one of the camps near Virginia City, but he had died in an accident 6 months earlier, leaving her with no means of support and no family to turn to for help. The mining company had evicted her from company housing, and her attempt to find work had been complicated by the fact that decent employment for women was scarce in mining country, while indecent employment was all too readily available. As the days passed, Sarah began to share more of her story with Samuel, revealing layers of hardship and injustice that went far beyond simple widowhood. Her husband's death had not been the accident that the mining company claimed, but the result of negligence and corner cutting that had made the mines increasingly dangerous for the men who worked in them. When Sarah had tried to pursue compensation for her husband's death, she had discovered a web of corruption that protected the company's interests at the expense of workers' safety and families' welfare. "They offered me $20 and told me to be grateful," Sarah explained as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the sun set over the harsh beauty of the desert landscape. $20 for a man's life, for 3 years of marriage, for all the plans we'd made together. When I refused and started asking questions about the safety violations that killed him, they made it clear that I was no longer welcome in the camp. Her attempt to find justice had made her enemies among the company officials and their political allies, who viewed her as a troublemaker whose persistence threatened their profitable arrangements. When legal channels proved futile, Sarah had begun organizing the other widows and families of miners who had died in preventable accidents, creating an informal network of women who shared information and supported each other in their struggles against corporate indifference. "That's when things got dangerous," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the weight of memories she would rather forget. "They couldn't intimidate me directly without creating more problems for themselves, but they could make life impossible in other ways. No one would hire me. No one would rent me a room. And finally, they hired some men to make it clear that I needed to leave the territory entirely if I wanted to avoid more serious consequences." The threats had escalated until Sarah had been forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on her back, walking across hostile country in the hope of reaching San Francisco, where she had relatives who might take her in. The journey had been longer and more difficult than she had anticipated, and by the time she reached Samuel's ranch, she was nearly at the end of her physical and emotional endurance. Samuel listened to her story with the careful attention of someone who understood both injustice and the courage required to fight against it. He had seen enough of frontier life to know that Sarah's experience was not unusual. Mining companies, cattle barons, and railroad corporations routinely destroyed individual lives in pursuit of profit, confident that their wealth and political connections would protect them from consequences. What impressed him about Sarah was not just her willingness to fight for what was right, but her refusal to become bitter or broken despite the overwhelming odds against her. As Sarah regained her strength and began to help with the daily work of maintaining the ranch, Samuel found himself looking forward to their evening conversations and the way her presence had brought life back to a house that had been silent for too many years. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a dry sense of humor that had survived all her trials. More importantly, she shared his appreciation for the harsh beauty of the desert country and his understanding that sometimes solitude was necessary for healing and growth. 3 weeks after her arrival, Samuel made a discovery that would change both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. While helping Sarah mend some of his old clothes, he noticed that she was sewing with the kind of precise, artistic skill that went far beyond basic needlework. When he commented on her ability, Sarah smiled and revealed another aspect of her background that she had kept hidden until now. "I wasn't always a miner's wife," Sarah said, her hands continuing their precise work on the intricate embroidery. She was adding to one of Samuel's plain work shirts. "Before I married Thomas, I taught school in San Francisco and ran a small dressmaking business on the side. I came from a family that believed women should be educated and self-sufficient, even if society didn't always support those ideals." The revelation explained much about Sarah's bearing and intelligence, as well as her refusal to accept injustice without fighting back. She had been raised to think for herself and to believe that she had both the right and the responsibility to make her own way in the world. Her marriage to Thomas Mitchell had been a love match rather than a necessity, and their move to the mining country had been part of a shared dream to make their fortune and return to civilization with enough money to start a family and build the kind of life they both wanted. "Thomas believed that the mines would make us rich enough to open our own school," Sarah continued, her voice carrying a mixture of grief and determination. "We plan to teach both children and adults, to help people improve their lives through education and practical skills. When he died, I lost more than a husband. I lost a future that we have been building together." Samuel found himself deeply moved by Sarah's story and impressed by her resilience in the face of losses that would have broken many people. But he was also beginning to understand that her presence at his ranch represented more than just temporary refuge for a woman in distress. Sarah possessed skills and knowledge that could benefit not just his isolated homestead, but the entire region if properly applied. "Show me what else you can do," Samuel said, genuinely curious about the extent of her abilities. Over the following days, Sarah demonstrated a range of practical and artistic skills that amazed Samuel with their sophistication and potential value. She could design and sew clothing that was both beautiful and durable, cook meals that transformed basic ingredients into genuinely appetizing food, and teach reading and writing to adults who had never had the opportunity for formal education. Most remarkably, she possessed an intuitive understanding of business and organization that could help small communities develop the infrastructure necessary for growth and prosperity. Samuel began to envision possibilities that had never occurred to him during his years of solitary existence. Sarah's skills could transform his ranch from a simple cattle operation into a center of commerce and education that would serve the scattered homesteads and mining camps throughout the region. But more than that, her presence had awakened in him a sense of purpose and companionship that he had thought lost forever when his wife died. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars appear in the clear desert sky, Samuel made a proposal that surprised both of them with its boldness. "What if you didn't try to reach San Francisco?" he asked quietly. "What if you stayed here and helped me build something that Thomas would have been proud of?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications of what Samuel was suggesting. "You're talking about more than just sharing a ranch," she said finally. "You're talking about creating a new kind of life entirely." Samuel nodded, understanding that he was asking her to trust her with her future in a way that went far beyond simple hospitality. "I'm talking about partnership," he said. "Business, personal, whatever you're comfortable with. But I'm also talking about the chance to build something that would honor your husband's memory while creating opportunities for other people who need what we could offer." The proposal was both practical and deeply personal, reflecting Samuel's growing understanding that Sarah represented not just companionship, but the possibility of creating a legacy that would outlast both their individual lives. Sarah's acceptance of Samuel's proposal marked the beginning of a transformation that would ultimately extend far beyond their individual relationship. Working together, they began to develop his ranch into something unprecedented in the region, a combination of working cattle operation, educational center, and refuge for women who found themselves in circumstances similar to those that had brought Sarah to his door. The first step was practical: expanding the ranch house to accommodate students and guests, improving the water supply to support a larger population, and establishing the kind of infrastructure necessary for a community rather than just an individual homestead. Samuel's years of frontier experience provided the practical knowledge necessary for such expansion, while Sarah's education and business sense guided the planning and organization of their ambitious project. Word of their unusual partnership began to spread to the network of mining camps, small towns, and isolated homesteads that dotted the region. Stories traveled along the informal communication channels that connected frontier communities: traders, itinerant preachers, traveling salesmen, and the constant flow of people seeking opportunities in the still-developing West. Some of these stories were accurate, others were embellished, but all of them conveyed the essential truth that something new and hopeful was being created at the Garrett Ranch. The first woman to seek them out arrived just 2 months after Sarah had accepted Samuel's proposal. She was a widow named Martha Collins, whose husband had died in a mining accident similar to one that had killed Thomas Mitchell. Like Sarah, she had been offered inadequate compensation and then pressured to leave the area when she refused to accept the company's terms. Unlike Sarah, however, she had 2 young children to care for and no family anywhere to turn to for help. Samuel and Sarah welcomed Martha and her children without hesitation, providing them with shelter and gradually helping Martha develop the skills necessary to support herself and her family independently. Sarah's teaching abilities proved invaluable in this process, as she was able to provide both basic education for the children and practical training for Martha in skills that could generate income in a frontier economy. The success of this first case established a pattern that would be repeated dozens of times over the following months. Women who had been left destitute by the death of their husbands, or who had fled abusive relationships, or who had simply found themselves without resources in a hostile environment, began to make their way to the Garrett Ranch. Each one brought her own skills, experiences, and potential contributions to the growing community that was developing around Samuel and Sarah's original partnership. What made their approach unusual was its emphasis on education and empowerment rather than simple charity. Women who came to the ranch were expected to contribute to the community according to their abilities, to learn new skills that would make them self-sufficient, and to help other women who arrived after them. It was a model that created strength through mutual support rather than dependence through continued assistance. By the end of their first year together, Samuel and Sarah were hosting nearly 30 women and children on a more or less permanent basis, with dozens more who had stayed temporarily before moving on to establish their own households or businesses elsewhere. The ranch had become a recognized destination for women in distress throughout the region, and its reputation for providing both immediate help and long-term solutions had spread far beyond the immediate area. The transformation in Samuel's own life was equally remarkable. The solitary rancher who had lived in silence for 15 years had become the patriarch of an extended family that looked to him for guidance, protection, and practical leadership. His natural reserve and careful judgment made him an ideal mentor for women who had learned to be cautious about trusting men, while his frontier skills and business sense provided the foundation for their collective security and prosperity. As word of the Garrett Ranch continued to spread throughout California and the surrounding territories, Sarah began to receive letters from women she had never met. Women who had heard stories about the community she and Samuel were building and who wanted to express their gratitude for the hope it represented. These letters revealed the existence of an informal network of women throughout the West who were struggling with similar challenges, and who saw the ranch as proof that alternatives to desperation and destitution were possible. Many of these correspondents were not in immediate need of refuge themselves, but were wives, sisters, daughters, or friends of women who might someday require the kind of help that the ranch provided. Others were women who had found their own solutions to difficult circumstances and who wanted to share their experiences and resources with others facing similar challenges. Gradually, Sarah began to understand that she and Samuel had become part of something much larger than they had originally intended, a movement of women supporting women across the vast distances and cultural barriers that characterize frontier life. The letters she received came from mining camps in Montana, cattle ranches in Texas, farming communities in Oregon, and frontier towns throughout the territories. They spoke of women who were teaching themselves to read, starting their own businesses, organizing mutual aid societies, and finding ways to survive and thrive despite laws and customs that offered them little protection or opportunity. Sarah began to correspond regularly with these women, sharing practical advice about everything from home remedies to business management to strategies for dealing with hostile authorities. The exchange of information and ideas enriched the programs at the ranch, while also strengthening the connections between women throughout the region who were working to improve their own circumstances and those of their communities. One of the most significant developments was the establishment of what Sarah called the Traveling Teacher Program. Women who had developed particular skills or knowledge would spend several weeks at the ranch, sharing their expertise with the resident community and learning new skills from others. These teachers then traveled to other communities, spreading knowledge and techniques that could benefit women throughout the region. The program created a constant flow of visitors to the ranch, each one bringing new ideas and taking away knowledge that would benefit women in distant locations. The diversity of skills and backgrounds represented by these traveling teachers was remarkable. There were women who knew traditional medicine, others who understood legal procedures, seamstresses who could teach advanced techniques, cooks who specialized in making nutritious meals from limited ingredients, and teachers who could provide instruction in everything from basic literacy to advanced mathematics. Samuel found himself learning alongside the women, acquiring skills that improved both his personal life and his ability to support the growing community. The ranch was also becoming economically self-sufficient through the collective efforts of its residents and the goods and services they produced. The women's needlework and crafts found ready markets in the growing towns of California, while their teaching services were increasingly in demand throughout the region. Samuel's cattle operation continued to provide basic support, but the diversified economy that had developed around it was actually more profitable and sustainable than his original ranching activities had been. By their second year together, Samuel and Sarah were able to purchase additional land and expand their operations to accommodate the growing number of women who wanted to be part of their community. But they were also beginning to understand that their influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of their property, reaching women throughout the West who had never visited the ranch, but who drew inspiration and practical guidance from knowing that it existed. The idea for what would later be called the Great Gathering originated in a letter from a woman named Elena Vasquez, who lived in a small farming community near Los Angeles. Elena had been corresponding with Sarah for months, sharing information about organizing women's mutual aid societies and exchanging practical advice about everything from childcare to small business management. In her latest letter, she proposed something that was both ambitious and unprecedented: a gathering of women from throughout California and the surrounding territories to be held at the Garrett Ranch during the harvest season, when travel was easiest and agricultural work was temporarily reduced. "We have learned so much from each other through letters," Elena wrote, "but there is something to be said for meeting face to face, for seeing with our own eyes what you and Mr. Garrett have accomplished, and for bringing together women who have been supporting each other from great distances. I believe such a gathering would strengthen all of us and perhaps inspire others to create similar communities in their own regions." Sarah was immediately intrigued by the proposal, but she was also concerned about the practical challenges of hosting what could be a very large gathering. The ranch was already operating at near capacity, and the addition of even 50 or 60 visitors would strain their resources severely. More concerning was the question of how such a gathering might be perceived by the authorities and the general public, many of whom already viewed the ranch with suspicion and some hostility. Samuel, however, was enthusiastic about Elena's proposal from the moment Sarah shared it with him. "We've been helping women one at a time, or a few at a time," he said thoughtfully. "But if we could bring together women from all over the region, think about what they could learn from each other and what they could accomplish when they went back to their own communities." His support gave Sarah the confidence to begin planning what would become the most significant event in the ranch's history. Letters went out to correspondents throughout the West, inviting them not just to attend but to spread word of the gathering to other women who might benefit from participating. The response was overwhelming. Within 6 weeks, Sarah had received confirmations from more than 200 women representing communities from Mexico to Oregon, from the Pacific Coast to the Colorado Territory. The diversity of backgrounds and experiences represented by the expected attendees was remarkable. There were farm wives from the Central Valley, teachers from mining camps, seamstresses from San Francisco, merchants from frontier towns, and even a few women who had established their own ranches or businesses despite the legal and social obstacles that made such achievements extremely difficult. What united them was not their circumstances, but their determination to create better lives for themselves and their families, and their belief that cooperation and mutual support were essential for achieving those goals. The practical challenges of hosting such a gathering were enormous. Food had to be prepared for hundreds of people, sleeping arrangements had to be made for those who couldn't return home each night, and activities had to be organized that would be meaningful for women with such diverse interests and experiences. Samuel threw himself into the preparations with characteristic thoroughness, organizing the men from nearby ranches to help with construction of temporary shelters and the preparation of the large quantities of food that would be required. But as the day of the gathering approached, both Samuel and Sarah began to understand that they were planning more than just a meeting. They were organizing an event that would have symbolic and practical significance far beyond anything they had originally envisioned. Word of the gathering had spread beyond the network of women who had been invited to participate, reaching authorities and community leaders who viewed it with varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and alarm. The morning of the gathering began before dawn with a sound that Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. At first, he thought he was dreaming. A soft melody seemed to be drifting across the desert, carried on the pre-dawn breeze like the echo of some half-remembered song. But as he became more fully awake, he realized that the sound was real and growing stronger with each passing moment. Voices, women's voices, were harmonizing in an ancient melody that seemed to transform the harsh landscape into something sacred and welcoming. Sarah was already awake, standing at the window and watching the eastern horizon where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. "Listen," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder and emotion. "They're coming." The singing grew stronger as the darkness retreated, revealing a sight that neither Samuel nor Sarah had anticipated despite all their preparations. The women were arriving not in the scattered groups they had expected, but as a coordinated procession that stretched across the valley like a river humanity, flowing toward the ranch. They came on horseback, in wagons, and on foot, but they moved with the synchronized purpose of people participating in something far more significant than a simple meeting. At the head of the procession rode Elena Vasquez, the woman whose letter had started the entire gathering. She was a striking figure, tall and straight in the saddle, her dark hair braided with ribbons that caught the early morning light, her voice leading the chorus that had awakened the entire valley. Behind her came women representing every ethnic group and social class in the American West. Anglo farm wives riding side by side with Mexican seamstresses, Chinese merchants' wives sharing wagons with Irish railroad workers' widows, Native American women on horseback, alongside German immigrants who had walked hundreds of miles to be present. The song they sang was not in any single language, but seemed to blend elements from all the cultures represented in their ranks. It was a melody that spoke of journey and arrival, of struggle and hope, of individual strength finding power through collective purpose. The words, when Samuel could make them out, spoke of women who had found their way through darkness and were now gathered in the light of shared understanding and mutual support. As the procession drew closer to the ranch house, Samuel could see the faces of the women more clearly, and what he saw moved him to tears despite his usual emotional reserve. These were faces that bore the marks of hardship and struggle, but they were also faces that radiated determination, intelligence, and an unmistakable sense of joy at being part of something larger than their individual circumstances. Some of the women he recognized from Sarah's correspondence, faces that had become familiar through the photographs that had accompanied letters over the months of planning. Others were strangers, but their presence spoke to the power of the informal networks that connected women throughout the frontier, networks that had spread word of the gathering far beyond the original invitation list. The singing continued as the women arranged themselves in a vast semicircle around the ranch house, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to make the very air vibrate with emotion and purpose. Samuel estimated that there were at least 200 women present, perhaps more, representing communities from throughout California and the surrounding territories. It was a gathering unlike anything he had ever witnessed, combining the practical purpose of a business meeting with the spiritual power of a religious revival. When the song finally ended, the silence that followed was profound and meaningful, broken only by the soft sounds of horses and the whisper of wind through the desert sage. Elena Vasquez urged her horse forward, approaching the porch where Samuel and Sarah stood watching in amazement. "Samuel Garrett," Elena called out, her voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "We have come to thank you for opening your heart and your home to our sister Sarah, and for helping her create a place where women can find refuge, education, and hope." Her words triggered a response from the assembled women that began as individual voices, but quickly grew into a unified chorus of gratitude and celebration. They had come not to ask for help or to demand assistance, but to acknowledge the significance of what Samuel and Sarah had accomplished and to pledge their support for continuing and expanding the work that had been started at the ranch. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Samuel had experienced in his 67 years of life. One by one, representatives from different communities stepped forward to speak about what the ranch had meant to them. Some had stayed there themselves, others had friends or relatives who had been helped, and still others had simply drawn inspiration from knowing that such a place existed. Each speaker brought gifts that represented the contributions their communities wanted to make to the ongoing work. Bolts of cloth for sewing, books for the library that Sarah had established, tools for the workshops where women learned trades, and money that had been collected through church offerings and community fundraising efforts. But the most significant gift was not material but symbolic. The women had decided to establish a formal network that would connect communities throughout the West, providing a permanent structure for the mutual support and information sharing that had previously been informal and sporadic. The ranch would serve as a central hub for this network, but each participating community would also serve as a local resource center where women could find help, education, and support. "We are founding something new," Elena announced as the ceremony reached its climax. "A sisterhood that crosses all boundaries of race, class, and geography. A network of women helping women that will ensure that no one need face hardship alone." Samuel found himself formally inducted into the sisterhood as an honorary member, a recognition of his role in creating the safe space where such an organization could be born. The women presented him with a hand-sewn banner that bore symbols from all their different cultures, creating a visual representation of the diversity and unity that characterized their movement. As the formal ceremony concluded and the women began to settle in for the 3 days of workshops, meetings, and celebration that had been planned, Samuel reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. He had begun by offering simple hospitality to one desperate woman, but that act of basic human kindness had grown into something that would touch the lives of thousands of women throughout the American West. The ranch that had been his private refuge from the world had become a symbol of hope and possibility for women who had previously faced their challenges in isolation. Sarah, meanwhile, had found her purpose in creating an organization that would outlast both their individual lives and continue the work of supporting and empowering women for generations to come. The gathering lasted 3 days, but its effects would be felt for decades as the women returned to their communities carrying new knowledge, renewed determination, and the confidence that came from knowing they were part of a larger movement for change. The network they established would grow to include hundreds of communities throughout the West, creating a support system that would help countless women survive and thrive in circumstances that had previously seemed hopeless. Years later, when Samuel was in his 80s and Sarah had become a nationally recognized leader in women's education and rights, they would look back on that morning when 200 women rode into their valley singing as the moment when their individual acts of compassion had grown into a movement that changed the lives of an entire generation. The woman with no shoes who had arrived at Samuel's gate in desperation had become the founder of an organization that provided shoes, both literal and metaphorical, to women throughout the American frontier.